A poll this morning suggests that 52% of the country think that the UK is moving in the wrong direction, and the personal ratings of the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, and the Deputy Prime Minister have fallen. Is Labour's honeymoon period over already? Welcome to the latest Downtown Den Politics podcast.
Just all bigoted women.
And my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Welcome back to the Den, everybody. My name's Frank McKenna. I'm the Chief Executive and Group Chair of Downtown in Business. As ever, I'm joined by Joe Phillips, the former advisor to Paddy Ashdown, and a much happier Downtown in Business political commentator, Jim Hancock, whose mighty Plymouth Argyle secured a point on Saturday with a 1-1 draw against Hull, whilst Joe and I's sides, West Ham and Everton, suffered terrible losses, but we may get onto that later on, possibly not. But we'll also be talking in the second part of today's conversation about France and President Macron, and indeed Rishi Sunak, and whether those two gentlemen think now, in hindsight, they may have called the elections a little early from their perspective. Anyway, let's get on to this new poll that's come out this morning. It's an Ipsos poll. It's early days for the Labour government, but nevertheless, Jim, not happy reading for the Prime Minister this morning. Keir Starmer's ratings have gone down, as have Angela Rayner's, as have Rachel Reeves. And I guess this is all against the backdrop of big pay rises for public sector and other unions being awarded. And of course, we've had the riots. And I guess there might be a little concern over Rachel Reeves's comments a couple of weeks ago that, well, of course, taxes will have to go up because, look, we've found this £22 billion hole in our budget. What are you making of it all, Jim?
Well, I'm going to make a big criticism of Labour's attitude to the pay deals for the unions in a moment. But overall, I want to say, let's not panic. I mean, you know, we live in a very febrile world now, and it's not surprising that on contact with government, any political party that in opposition looks wonderful in relation to the people who've been doing it for 14 years and often messing it up. So I'm not surprised by that, and I don't think it need cause Keir Starmer any concern whatsoever at this stage. Let's just chill out on that. My main concern is over the approach to public sector pay. I mean, first, my particular gripe with the ASLEF union getting the pay deal without any conditions. I mean, it's not just the fact that they've not agreed to 7-day working. So we're all vulnerable on a Sunday to get a train, and it won't be there because the people have not volunteered for work. I think that's a thing that should have been conditional on this pay rise. But they've also got lots of Spanish practices. I mean, we're going back to the 1970s. Let's use the phrases that we used then. A ban on digital devices, taking 9 workers, apparently. I mean, this is from the Mail, so there's a caveat on it, but lots of different people to change a light bulb, walking allowances from the canteen to their place of work, breaks being extended, manual maintenance as opposed to using digital maintenance. So nothing's been extracted from ASLEF. But on the broader point, just finally, you know, these, and I know the argument from Rachel Reeves is that the strikes cost the public sector money. So in a sense, it's a way of dealing with the public finances. But they've given so much away that they've got no bargaining chip. And hey, presto, we're already seeing RMT saying, oh, we'd like a bit of that. And we're going to get a real pile on from other unions as well. And so I just think it should have been approached more cautiously, and it plays to this narrative. I know Joe's going to talk about this, and I'm going to agree with her, anticipating what she's going to say about union barons and all this sort of stuff, because we hardly know the people, apart from perhaps the leaders of the rail unions. We hardly know who they are nowadays, whereas in the old days, people like Jack Jones and Huey Scanlon were virtually in number 10 all the time and were big powers in the land. So that's overdone. But nevertheless, I just think it should have been handled a little bit more strategically, and the government should have kept a little bit in their pocket to agree to things based on working conditions.
Joe, your view on this poll and also Jim's comments in terms of the deals that have been struck with the unions?
Well, I agree with Jim in that, you can't read too much into a poll. I mean, we're not even 2 months into the new government, and there is no doubt that they have inherited an absolute disastrous mess from 14 years of Tory chaos. The riots, of course, were totally out of the blue, and I think that, broadly speaking, as we discussed last week, the government has handled it quite well. But of course, the knock-on effect of that is now the prisons are full. And so they've now, as of this morning, had to introduce this sort of emergency custodial thing whereby people are going to be held in police cells. Well, that's assuming there's a police station with a police cell. And what does that mean then if you've got some other riot or some other incident going on and you've got nowhere to put the people you're arresting? So there's an awful lot of things. And, as is always the case, when you get into government, you suddenly realise, blimey, I thought I was going to concentrate on this, and there's this coming from here and this coming from there, and and you can't focus. And that really is the test of government, as to, whether they're agile and how focused they are. With regard to the unions, I mean, I am so bored and sick to death of the Mail and the Express and the Telegraph using stuff that they might as well have printed in 1973 about the unions and the barons and the paymasters and this, that and the other, because it's absolute cobblers. There are far fewer people who belong to trade unions these days than there were in the 1970s. And it was good that the government, Keir Starmer's government, sat down and talked to the junior doctors and had talks with ASLEF. I think ASLEF's, to be fair, it is an LNER strike. It's separate to the main agreement that the government's reached with ASLEF. But there's an absolute kick in the teeth to a Labour government. And the perceptions, and as we know, perceptions count for an awful lot, are, they've given in to them. And of course, it's being played about pensioners are going to freeze to death while unions get fat. And they get fat because they get paid to walk from the canteen to their place of work, according to Jim. So, there's all of that going on, and they need to sort of get a grip on the narrative, because that is where it all begins to spiral out of control. And I don't see what they've got up their sleeve. We know there's going to be difficult decisions in the budget, but they need something good and something steady and something that people can feel the benefit from quite quickly.
But Joe, don't you believe that those Spanish practices should have been negotiated away for extra money?
Well, that's if you believe the Daily Mail, Well,
right. Well, let's just take Sunday working, which I know from personal experience.
Yes, I do, Jim. We all work in a peculiar environment where people are expected to work different hours and flexibility and working from home, etc., etc. I mean, I think the awful irony is, well, several things here very briefly. One is that in terms of public sector pay, the government has honoured the independent pay review body recommendations, which is fine, and that's what they should do, and that's what they would have been saying had the Tories still been in power. So you can put that to one side. Junior doctors has cost millions in locum fees, lost appointments, cancelled operations, etc. You need to get that back on track before we go into the autumn and winter to take the pressure off the NHS, because you can't talk about reforming the NHS, which Wes Streeting wants to do, unless you've actually got it, broadly speaking, working. And I think it's some unbelievable 800 million or 800 billion or whatever it is, huge figure, lost to business because of rail strikes over the last 2 years. And don't forget, Jim, Margaret Thatcher, when she came in, she did a very big settlement with the unions, basically to get that out of the way and get on with everything else. I mean, she then shafted the unions completely, as we know. But that, this is not a Labour precedent to do this. But I do agree they should have been a bit more canny about the negotiations. And you would have thought, wouldn't you, that they were in a position as a Labour government to say to us, look, come on, we'll do this, but you've got to give a little bit, because it's all about perception.
I think the point you make there, Joe, about Margaret Thatcher doing a big pay deal when she took over government in 1979 is something that Daily Mail and others perhaps need to be reminded of, because she saw the bigger picture. I think the difference, though, perhaps, is that Thatcher did have a plan for dealing with the unions, not one that I would necessarily subscribe to, but she did have a plan. Whereas, as Jim said, the fear will be other unions are looking at these pay deals thinking, oh, we'll have some of that. And the point that you made, where is the accompanying narrative as to the rationale as to why these pay settlements are being made? And I know it's August. I know lots of people go away on holiday, and it's ordinarily silly season where not an awful lot happened. It's been quite the opposite this summer, partially because of the riots, but also because of that mess that the government has inherited. And I take the point, they maybe have been wrong-footed on one or two of these issues, the riot in particular, of course. But surely they knew that these big issues, because they've been around for a couple of years now, would have to be dealt with. I think this was part of our concern in the run-up to the election, wasn't it, really? You know, this Ming-Vars strategy, okay, that might get you over the line, but surely they should have had a plan in place where they could hit the ground running, make these very difficult decisions, which are inevitably, I think, going to come in for some criticism, not just from the right-wing press, but from business leaders, for example, who are now concerned about what's going to happen with the employment rights legislation that is coming down the track. So, yeah, I think we can give them some leeway in terms of, yeah, it's early days, yeah, they've inherited a mess. But I would have anticipated a much stronger communication strategy, Jim. We've not really seen that, have we?
No, but again, I'd want to be fair to the government, having launched this attack about ASLEF, and say that surely the budget will give us that strategic outlook. And I'm just pushing back a little bit against the slight impatience that perhaps is from these findings about the government losing popularity and so on. The Chancellor needs time to prepare that strategy, having looked at the books. And it's one thing to make promises about strategy in opposition, but once you've got a full look at the books and you decided what to do, we'll get that on at the end of October. I mean, the problem is, that obviously everyone's impatient, and we live in this febrile world where 24 hours is a long time in politics, and that is the problem. And you're right to identify that that's the world we live in. And if the government don't control the narrative, somebody else will. I agree with that. But I'm not sure that there's much alternative but for us to wait for Rachel Reeves to give us the total picture at the end of October, where she'll have to bear in mind this argument about pensioners. I mean, I don't need the winter fuel allowance. I'm relaxed about that. And I think, 20 years ago, pensioners were the poorest section of the community. That's no longer the case. I mean, young people's poverty and people in their 20s trying to make a life for themselves and get a house and get a decent job. That's where the thrust should be, and that our generation should take the hit if that's the case. But I don't know if you agree with me, but I think can we hold on until the budget statement on the 30th of October?
Well, just to come back on that, Jim, I mean, what Labour needs to do is what they did under Tony Blair, masterminded by Alistair Campbell and Peter Mandelson. They need a rebuttal unit. So they need to stop these stories. This is not about every single pensioner being deprived of the winter fuel allowance. It is people who are extremely well off or well enough off to be able to afford heating. So, okay, nobody likes means testing, but you've got to do it in some cases. But they need to be rebutting that. They need to keep saying, this is not true. There will be, X million pensioners who may be affected, everybody on benefits, everybody on pension credits, everybody who is in need will be fine. But they're not rebutting stuff. And that's what happens, because if you don't rebut, And, you know, you could put this back into the context of a certain Daily Telegraph and before that Times Brussels correspondent spewing out absolute cobblers. That's twice I've said cobblers. About what was going on in Europe, about straight bananas and hairnets for fishermen, and, you know, whether the sausages could have pork in them, and all. One Boris Johnson. They were all complete lies. We know that, but nobody was rebutting it. Say this is, I'm going to say it again, cobblers. And actually, that's what you need to do. You don't necessarily have to have a different story. You just need to say that is rubbish.
And I think the problem partly perhaps is that because they adopted this view that you don't get in the way of an opponent who has given themselves a good kick, and so you don't have to say very much. And that's where Labour was for many months in the run-up to the general election, even during the election campaign, when I guess that their initial thinking was, we're going to have to start to campaign a little bit more proactively now. But then, of course, you know, you had the launch in the rain, you had the D-Day stuff, you had them going to the Titanic, you had the betting scandal. So there was little room really for Labour to get any sort of messaging going. So they continued through the election campaign, quite rightly, from a tactical perspective, to say as little as possible, because actually the Tories were doing themselves far more damage anyway. But now we come to government, and it seems to me that they've not stepped up to the plate. And I get what you guys are saying and said, look, it's early days, they've only been in for 2 months. The problem these days is once a perception is set, it is very difficult to shake that perception off. It's not like the 90s and the Labour government that came in under Blair. Although I would remind you, when Tony Blair went into his first conference in September, his personal rating stood at 93%. 93%. Now, again, you know, events, dear boy, that came on the back partly. That fabulous rating came on the back of his handling of the Diana situation. So we take that as read. But I just sensed that the communications of that Labour government had been prioritised and were as important to Tony Blair, Gordon Brown et al. As the policy. Whereas I think Keir and Rachel's thinking is, look, if we start to deliver, then it'll all be okay, because in a couple of years' time, maybe, or as Jim's saying, maybe the 30th of October, you know, they're going to unveil a budget that is very popular and so on. But my fear, as I say, my concern is that these days, do you get that sort of time? And yeah, I'm a bit worried, even though it's early days.
Is the I mean, we don't know. There's a great danger of us following the Mail's agenda, but I mean, is the allegations about the tensions between Sue Gray and Morgan McSweeney contributing to this? Because you know, Alistair Campbell would have knocked their heads together and started to communicate. I mean, I think that's what you're saying, Frank. Do we feel that there is a lack of direction because there's an ambiguity in the roles of these two individuals?
Well, I don't know whether that is a true story or whether that's just right-wing mischief making. But the point is, Joe's made the point. You've got to rebuke those sort of allegations. If those sort of attacks are coming at you, then you can't just sit back and allow it to continue to happen. You've got to come out very firmly and say, this is a load of nonsense. Those guys have got very distinctive roles within the government. They don't necessarily have to be best mates, actually, but they're not competing. And Morgan McSweeney's role, as I understand it, is very much still looking at campaigning, keeping the MPs happy and informed. Sue Gray, meanwhile, is dealing with the machinery of government. So very different roles. But as Joe's saying, there's silence from the government. And if there's silence, somebody else will fill the vacuum. And at the moment, the people who are filling the vacuum are the enemies of the government.
Well, and the other thing I would say is that I think in the run up to the election, and I think Labour have been rightly criticised for it, and that it is Jim's Ming Va's strategy. But so much of that was predicated on focus groups that, you know, they wouldn't breathe without running it through a focus group. Now, you know, Deborah Mattinson, who works for Gordon Brown, who has been director of strategy for Keir in opposition, you know, she was ruthless in, no, you've got to run it past a focus group. You've got to, you know, so there was never any sort of communication in what we would all understand as, and it's not spin, it's saying that's not true. This is true. But that really, really is important. And I think you're absolutely right, Frank, that has fallen by the wayside because nobody thought about it. And as you said, you know, the Tories were doing their own damage. They were doing their own Labour campaigning. But the real problem is you've got an awful lot of new MPs who will be going back to their constituencies, and they're going to have people turning up going, well, you're all the same, aren't you? You know, you're stealing from pensioners, you're giving in to your union mates, you haven't done this, that and the other, the prisons are full, you don't understand why people are rioting, and you know, what's going on, and what's more, you've got people who are corrupt and dishonest. And that's going to be hard for those individual MPs to deal with. Now, that's why you've got to have absolutely cast iron discipline in communications, and that's why you need somebody that every single day, every single hour is sending out stuff saying this is not true, this is true, here are 3 things that we have done since we came into government. And I don't see that happening.
Yeah, I just think they've got to try and get back on the front foot as quickly as possible. We haven't even mentioned the boats, you know, because they continue to come across. Now, ironically, the numbers aren't as great as when this fabulous silver bullet Rwanda policy was around. So there's a narrative that Labour can use again there, but they're not. The one thing I was surprised about in terms of this poll this morning, I thought Starmer would get more credit for the way in which he's handled the riots, because I think he did supremely well as far as that particular issue was concerned. Again, maybe we've got to wake up to the fact that although we were, I think, praiseworthy of the fact that he wasn't grandstanding, he simply went and did the job and then allowed the police and the courts to crack on and do what they needed to do. Maybe he does need to start to do a bit of grandstanding, guys, because otherwise people aren't necessarily getting the message.
It's not what he's comfortable doing, though, is it? He likes to administer, and his reaction to the riots was to deal with the practical side of it. You know, we're going to get the tough sentences, we're going to get the court sitting all day and all night, and dealing with it like that without giving it a sort of branding, which other leaders might have done. That's certainly the case.
Just stick with that for a second, Jim, and go back to that Labour government of the 90s and early noughties, and Gordon Brown, again, universally it's accepted that he was the guy who almost saved the world as far as the financial crash was concerned. Didn't get a jot of credit for it. And again, in terms of personality, perhaps similar to Keir Starmer, you know, could get across the detail of things, could deliver stuff, but got little or no credit for it. That's no good for a government that looks to, you know, needs 10 years to make the changes it wishes to make.
Yes, I mean, the only other point I'd make is that maybe people have said, yes, OK, Keir Starmer actually handled in a strong way these louts that were doing this. But the underlying issue of immigration was highlighted by the disturbances, and we are not happy about that. And we are not convinced that the Home Secretary is going to get any more of a grip on it than anybody else.
Yeah, perhaps that's the case as well. But the communications are important. I think they do need to reflect on what they've been up to the first couple of months. As I say, this August, very difficult, people away on holiday, so on and so forth, and nobody could have foreseen those riots that were going to take place. But I suggested in my blog on Friday that, you know, this idea that Labour have got such a huge majority that it means they are going to be in for 2 terms is for the birds, I'm afraid. You know, people who vote these days are so transient, so impatient, actually, for things to happen, that you just cannot think that you are inevitably going to go on to that second term. of office, Labour do have to start to deliver and make it clear what those delivery points are. So I think the conference in September in Liverpool is going to be very important, actually. I think they start to lay out their programme for change there very clearly, and way before that budget on the 30th of October, because again, in political terms these days, that's an age away. And in a sense, has that ever changed? Because as I think it was Harold Macmillan, wasn't it, who used the phrase, a week is a long time in politics. So
Wilson said a week's a long time in politics, and Harold Wilson and Harold Macmillan said events, dear boy, events. And those two things remain so true. Yeah.
Yes.
And who said crisis? What crisis, Tim?
Well, Tom McNally, who Frank and I knew very well. He was a Stockport MP and was.
Tom McNally.
Yeah, well, Tom denies that. Because in that time, Tom was an advisor to a press officer actually to Callaghan, and denies that Callaghan ever actually said that. But
I think he protested too much.
Well, we haven't got to that stage yet, whereby Keir Starmer is on the same sort of level as Jim Callaghan's government was back in the late 70s. But listen, it's just a little, if not a red flag, certainly an amber one that's saying, watch yourselves and perhaps sharpen up your communications, get your rebuttal unit out there a bit more firmly, and have, I think, some big statements to make during that Labour conference in Liverpool next month. So we'll see what happens. And
do they need an Alistair Campbell figure? I'm trying to think of the chap who's a chap with a beard. I know I've known him. I've known him for a long time, but as frequently with these podcasts, people I know well, I can't remember their names. But I mean, do we need the appointment of somebody like Alistair Campbell to provide this focus? Or just the regular press officers who do the briefings in the lobby?
Well, they should have had somebody there. I mean, it is very unusual, as I know, and you both know as well. But from working very closely with a leader, you've got to have their total trust, but you've also got to be able to say, that's nonsense, you can't do that, this is what will happen. And those people are quite hard to find in politics these days, because they've either pursued their own political careers or they've said, no thanks, I'm going off to earn a lot of money in the private sector. And I think, things have changed so much. And, do you want to then bring in somebody else who possibly causes friction that may or may not exist between Sue Gray and Morgan McSweeney? I mean, Matthew Doyle, who is head of comms,
Matthew Doyle, that's the guy. That's right. That's the name.
Well, I mean, he's been around an awfully long time. He was with Tony Blair. Then he went off to something else, and then he came back again. But he's not Alistair Campbell. And I'm not saying that Alistair is the be all and end all, but you had that twin thing of Alistair Campbell and Charlie Whelan, who, in a way, and I'm not saying it's a good thing, but they were muscular. And you need to be muscular to defend your position. You can't just go, oh, well, actually, no, you're not reading it clearly, because nobody's listening. And, here we are, 5-6 weeks in, we've forgotten how brilliant it was within the first week, 10 days, a NATO summit, the Blenheim Palace event, going to all these other sort of international things and appearing on the world stage and really setting the tone. But now we've gone to this, and I think that, as you both say quite rightly, people are so impatient. They're so ready to go, oh, you haven't got that, well, I'll have that then, thank you. I mean, if you did a poll and said, right, there's an election tomorrow, you'd probably find people were voting for all sorts of people. Maybe they haven't.
Maybe they, I don't know, maybe perhaps a woman could do it, someone with excellent communication skills and experience with former party leaders, whose perhaps only disadvantage might be that this mythical person was not of the same political persuasion as the party, but nevertheless, because of her skills, she was appointed to the job. How about that?
She's too busy with us, Jim. She's too. We're not going. We would be demanding a transfer fee greater than what Everton will have to Brownford.
I
So
think
that ain't going to happen.
You know, the easiest thing to do is to send them a preview of this before we release it to the public. They can have it on subscription only. They can have first dibs. Here's some very good advice from some old hands.
Well, we wait and see if the government does change direction in terms of its communications strategy. I think we're all agreed far too early to write off Keir Starmer and his team, and this poll is obviously only a snapshot of just over 1,000 people. Actually, it's not even one of these super polls, so it may not even reflect how the country feels. Certainly, the people that I talk to in and around business, very comfortable way the government has started, but some concerns around this employment legislation that's being talked of, not helped again, Joe, I guess, by some of the scandalous headlines, in the Daily Mail. You take somebody on in day one, you're going to have to keep them on until they're 100, and those sort of things.
Well,
but nonetheless, the communications, I think, are crucially important these days, more so actually than back in the 70s, 80s, 90s and beyond. So we've got to get that right. The new government's got to get that right if they want to, as I say, win a second term, which is the thing that Keir Starmer will have his eyes set on already, I guess. Anything else on this before we close and go to the break, guys? Any other thoughts?
I just want to commend you both for reminding me of Margaret Thatcher initially settling with the unions. I think that is a valid point, and particularly, of course, she initially settled with the miners. She gave into a pay deal, but it was, as you say, Frank, it was part of a strategy, because she thought, I'll settle with you now, but I'll have you next time. So it was a good reminder of things there. Just two other quick points. LNER, of course, where we're threatened with further strikes, is actually run by the government directly. So it's interesting that they're bringing more and more of these franchises back into public ownership. But with public ownership comes direct responsibility. And the final thing is, and this is something that Rachel will have to address in her budget, this easy way in which in the austerity years, Osborne had unprotected budgets, and that included local government and indeed justice and the prisons. But it just shows that they may be unprotected, but they'll come back to bite you with overcrowded prisons and a justice system that's creaking. Yeah,
the consequences of some of your actions you need to be very, very alive to, don't you? Joe, anything else on this before we go to a break?
No, but other than to say, you can keep blaming the Tories, but people aren't listening. You've got to make your own story, and you've got to tell the truth. And yes, you can blame the Tories. We all know that, but people are going la 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 la. It's white noise. You've got to have something to say. And they need to wheel out people who are really good communicators. Angela Rayner's really good. She's really straight. She really tells it how it is, and she will address those issues. Wes Streeting does a fantastic job. There are other people. But, if Louise Hay, the Transport Secretary, can't answer who's paying for the ASLEF deal, well, why not? Because that's the first question people are going to want to know. Am I paying for it, or are the rail companies? Or are the rail companies paying for it and then I'm going to pay for it in increased fares? They need to get it. They need to make it simple and just get some sense out there and get some good people. If it's not Keir Starmer, who I don't think is a brilliant performer, get some other people out there.
Yeah, you've got to have advocates, haven't you, who get those messages across. And I think you do have to have that, let's say, bully, for want of a better word, on the phone to those newspaper editors saying, what the bloody hell do you think you're doing? These are the real stories. And actually, if you continue with this tripe, we're going to have your guts for garters. And that was the approach that Alistair Campbell and Charlie Whelan took. And if Joe's not going to take the job, maybe we should be giving a call to Emily Maitlis. I think she's quite a feisty female as well. So there you go. Whether she'd take the job is anyone's guess. Right, after the break, we're going to be asking whether President Macron and Rishi Sunak are lying on a beach regretting the decisions that they made of calling early elections. And we'll have a very brief look at the convention that starts today in America. That's the Democratic Convention. because we've not mentioned yet that election that's happening in November in the States. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
This is the time of year when many of us are just returning from holiday and looking at how we're going to end the year in business with a bang. And with that in mind, Downtown in Business has put together an absolutely fantastic events programme for the remainder of 2024, including 3 awards dinners, the City of Manchester Business Awards, the City of Birmingham Business Awards, and our 22nd annual Liverpool Awards. So something to look forward to, and good luck to all the nominees. Many other events, of course, as well. If you go onto our website, all the W's downtowninbusiness.com, click on the events section and you will see what we have confirmed so far. But among the highlights, we've got the leader of Manchester City Council, Bev Craig, joining us for a roundtable event. We've got the new Chief Executive of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, Caroline Simpson, come along for a downtown event. In Liverpool, we've got the leader of the council, Liam Robinson, joining us. We have Steve Rotherham, the Mayor of Liverpool City Region, and Andrew Lewis, Chief Executive of the council as well. Plus a special event with the Liverpool Big Company, a conference on the 5th of September, People, Power, Places. Moving to the south and Birmingham, we're having an event with Naomi Smith, who is the Chief Executive of Best for Britain, who will be reflecting on the general election results and the new government. She'll be joined by Ryan Wayne, who is the Head of Policy at the Tony Blair Institute. And we've also got some great events across other parts of our region in Lancashire and Cheshire, Newcastle and Leeds as well. As I say, go to our website and you'll see all the details there. We look forward to meeting you at those events. And as I say, it's going to be a great end to the year if you're a member of Downtown in Business.
Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. And we're going to just reflect on whether it's a couple of gentlemen sunning themselves at the moment, thinking, what a mistake to make it. Because President Macron called a snap election in France, which he was then roundly thumped in. And that came on the back of European elections where the National Rally, formerly National Front, had done particularly well. And Macron thought it'd be a clever wheeze to say to the French people, well, if that's what you really want, then you can have it. And it's resulted in a bit of a chaotic result and a bit of a mess in the French Parliament, actually, truth be told. Now, subsequently, the French have hosted an absolutely magnificent Olympic Games. And I'm told President Macron's ratings have significantly improved alongside that. So is he regretting his decision? And then this week, I was listening to a couple of other podcasts. Oh, what a traitor I am. And I heard Grant Shapps explaining why he thought Sunak had called the election too early. And then somebody I have greater respect for, Gillian Keegan, the former education minister, who made similar points. And of course, what they were pointing to was that the economic news over the course of the past 6 weeks or so has been much better than it was previously. And there are signs that the UK economy is getting to the place where Sunak was predicting it will get to. And of course, the other point that they made was that although it was a surprise election, it was more of a surprise to the Conservative Party than it was to the opposition. So it didn't make much sense, really. Joe, Jim, I'll start with you, Joe. Will those two guys be thinking, oh, we've made a bit of a boob here, we should have waited?
I think Macron, no. Although it seemed a rather bizarre idea to call an election, with the Olympics just weeks away. because of their rather different political system, it's probably put him in a better position. And that second vote they had that saw the sort of alliance of the left to fend off the far right, put that into abeyance, put Marie Le Pen into some sort of abeyance for a time being. So it's bought him time in a way. And I think, with that goodwill factor of the post-Olympics, and all that has done for France and its standing, the fact that, the French foreign minister was with David, or is with David Lamy in the Middle East at the moment. And there's a better global image perhaps of France. I think in a way it's bought him time. He did the sort of John Major thing, back me or sack me, didn't he? And they just about managed to not sack him, but they've got the left fighting like, cats in a sack. But I think it's bought him time to look more magnifique, if you like, whilst Marie Le Pen and all that lot sort themselves out. As for Rishi Sunak, I can barely remember what he looks like. I can just have this, in the dim and distant past, a man standing there like a seal outside Downing Street, completely wet. Where is he? He's the leader of the opposition, for crying out loud. He hasn't said anything. He hasn't said anything since the election, unless it has completely passed me by. He hasn't said anything about the riots. And every comment that's coming from the Conservatives is only coming from the wannabe leaders, particularly James, not Tom, cleverly. And, you sort of think, well, I think he called the election because I don't think he could hack it anymore. And I think, who knows whether the awful events of Southport would have happened if Rishi Sunak and his government had still been in power. And who knows what the response would have been from people like us if the crackdown on protesters had been as draconian as it has been under Labour, which we've all said is a good thing to do. But would we have been saying, oh, this crackdown on, free speech, it's censorship, it's, all that stuff. I mean, I just think, as we said earlier, politics is changing by the hour. And the Tories had run out of steam. They were never going to, even if the economy, it's bucking up a little bit, but it's very fragile still. But even if things were going gangbusters, as some economists said over the weekend, I'm not sure that anybody would have listened to a word they said, because they were just coming out with, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that, and the boats and immigration, and stoking the flames. So I think actually he was probably right to go when he did. And if we ever see him back in this country, it'll be a miracle.
It's interesting. Gillian Keegan did make the point, Jim, that she didn't think the Tories would have won, but she did think perhaps they'd have won more seats. Now, people like us might say, well, what does that matter? We'd have still had a Labour government. But of course, for those 30 or 40 MPs who may have been saved, then it does matter, because they basically made redundant much earlier than they'd anticipated. What's your thoughts on it?
No, I think it would have been a lesser defeat in the autumn, because the economic upturn would have given them some credibility. But Joe makes a good point about all this, and it's the whataboutery of history. Would the riots have been depicted as the final denouement of this discredited government? That not only were they not trusted on anything, not only was the economy not doing well, but now the country was in revolt. That might have turned a different way, or Sunak handling it in much the same way as Starmer did might have given him some enhanced authority, so that the majority would not have been so large. So I think that would have happened in the autumn. And there is great bitterness in the Conservative Party that the organisation was put in such a position with unselected candidates. So it does seem a very strange decision. And evidence is coming out now that at the very last minute, even that tight inner circle that decided to go for a July poll did have last minute doubts and wanted to pull it back. But by that time, the King, who I think was in Scotland at the time on holiday or something, had arranged to come back, and sort of protocol issues like that made them have to go through with something that even they at the last minute decided was a bad idea. As far as France is concerned, I do think it was a bit of an arrogant spasm by Macron to call the election, but the net result has been, and of course as Joe has said, they have a different political system. The president is far more powerful than the prime minister. The net result has been Macron's gained all the glory from the Olympics, and it's probably helped his position with regard to a presidential election. The French Parliament, I think, is still in disarray as a result of what Macron did, but from his own personal point of view, probably he's been lucky, like Napoleon was a lucky emperor. And it's worked out reasonably well for him, but I do think it was a spasmodic reaction at the time.
Well, we will wait and see what Rishi Sunak has to say when he comes back from his extended holiday. Joe, he may at one point write some memoir.
Well, just on that. I mean, Rishi Sunak wanted to resign immediately, in my opinion, as Conservative leader. He has stayed on just to preside over this leadership election. But, I mean, he probably should have issued some statements. His silence is not really on. But on the other hand, I don't think he cares that much now. I think he's flattened and depressed by it. So let's put it in context. He's only staying there to be the referee for the contest. He's not really there to project any Conservative policies at all.
No,
the
but
problem is, though, Jim,
still...
he's still the leader of the opposition, isn't he? He's still drawing his salary. He's not, as far as I'm aware, said that money can go to charity because he doesn't really want to be doing the job. These are the sort of things that, okay, from a political perspective, those of us who follow it closely would say, well, we understand that. That's sort of something we can shake off. But for Joe and Joanne public out there, they're looking at this thing, where is the guy?
Yeah.
He's decided he's going to stay on. Whether he wants to, that's the decision he's made. He's the leader of the opposition.
Yeah.
There's these riots going on. And the guys, I think he put a tweet out, didn't he? And that was it. Kia's doing a good job, basically, was the message, I think.
But yes, and it's not that difficult. He is leader of His Majesty's opposition. It is an official and quite serious role. And if you're not going to take it seriously, or at least give the pretense of taking it seriously, then get off, go. They could have
because they could have put an interim in.
Well, of course they could. They could have had anybody.
Mel Stride, my friend Mel Stride, the man I want to be the opposition.
Mel Stride's on.
Bring in Mel now. Yes.
Mel Stride has slipped. But anybody could have done it and said, "I am taking over." Until we have a leadership election. I don't want to stand for leadership. They could have done that, but I think it's pretty poor show, actually. There are still big things going on in the world, and you would expect the opposition, as opposed to the Tory leadership candidates, to have something to say.
No, I'm not as forgiving as James, I'm afraid, over Mr. Sunak's lack of performance. But listen, before we close this episode, let us turn our attentions to the American presidential election. Today sees the start of the Chicago convention for the Democrats. And of course, Kamala Harris is expected to, well, not expected, will be crowned as their candidate, with Walz as vice presidential pick. I think we've got Joe Biden doing a speech, so it'll be interesting to see whether he can stay awake for the hour that he's due to be on the stage. I think we've got Barack Obama doing a turn as well. And then, of course, we've got Walz and the woman of the moment. And her selection has caused a huge movement in the polls. From being 9 points ahead, Trump now finds himself tied with the Democratic candidate. He's fuming with that, isn't he? Absolutely doesn't know where to go. But what are we expecting from the Chicago convention? Not, I hope, Jim, what we saw in 1968, which was absolutely chaotic. It followed, of course, Robert Kennedy's assassination. So the favourite for the Democrat nomination was not in place, of course. We had Hubert Humphrey, was it, who eventually became the nominee, and he was up against Nixon. It was against the backdrop of a Vietnam War. Of course, we've got Gaza going at this moment in time. So there are some parallels, but my guess would be that it's going to be a far calmer city this week as Chicago.
Yes, I mean, Hubert Humphrey, I think, was from Minnesota, which is where Mr. Waltz is from. But it was overshadowed by the Vietnam War protests. They wanted to push the Democrats into ending the war, and Mayor Daley was a ruthless operator. He'd arguably fixed the election for Jack Kennedy in 1960 and was a party city boss, and ruthlessly put down the demonstrations, and tear gas was actually filtering into the Democratic election headquarters. So I mean, it was, in terms of presentation, it was awful. And you know, and Nixon, who wasn't a particularly popular figure with the people of the United States, they turned to him as a man who'd bring some order to the country, and that's why he won. No, it'll be a very different affair. And you know, this opinion poll turnaround that she's got will be enhanced this week. I mean, 4 nights of television exposure will give her a further bounce, and then we'll see what happens. Because I was listening to another podcast, being a traitor like you, but I only listened to them, Frank, to be more informed for our top podcast. Was that she actually needs to sustain a 6-point lead just to narrowly win, and she hasn't got that yet on a sustained basis. So you know, there'll be a bounce after the Democratic election. There'll be a lot of talk about, my goodness, you know, she turned things around. Then she's had a convention and she'll be riding high at the end of August. Then will come the debates, and hopefully we'll get some policy discussed, because I don't know about you guys, but this sort of name calling back and forth, it's like the school playground. It's absolutely policy light. It's demeaning, and it needs to end.
You looking forward to the convention, Joe?
Well, I think she's just, you know, she's transformed it from what was looking like a ghastly, predictable outcome to something that people have got hope for. And, you know, she is vivacious, she's young, she is normal, you know, and Trump is completely going off-piste, even to the angst of his own advisors and his own team. I mean, I've even seen it in a few of the American commentators saying, is he actually having a breakdown? Is he suffering from the post-traumatic shock of that assassination attempt? And one of the other podcasts, possibly the same one that Jim mentioned, Justin Webb was talking about, you know, the ghost of frailty, which was always there behind Biden, is now behind Trump. Who is increasingly deranged. J.D. Vance, you know, if he gets more misogynistic, it's hard to believe he won't link up with Andrew Tate at some point. But, you know, there are things, you know, there are clouds everywhere. There will be a pro-Palestinian demonstration, probably not on the scale of the anti-Vietnam War, but that's going to happen in Chicago. As you both rightly say, Kamala Harris has been very light on policy. But, you know, at the moment, maybe the people who are going to vote for her don't care anyway, because they've at last found someone they can vote for. But you've got to get those other people in order to get over the line. So, I mean, it'll be interesting to see. But in terms of coverage, I mean, as far as I know, they've raised millions and millions and millions of dollars. They haven't actually had to spend any, as far as we know, because she's getting news coverage because she's news, whereas Trump is, well, weird. As Walt famously said, and is probably the best reason that he should be vice president. He summed it up in one word, and that ridicule is far better. But yeah, we do need to move away from name calling and get onto policies.
Yeah, he's struggling for the oxygen that he usually gets, isn't he, Trump? Although he's not done too badly. He's announced last night that he's better looking than Kamala Harris. So I think we should go to the polls on the basis of who's right and wrong on that particular point, maybe. I think she'd win that one. But, you know, again, it just demonstrates the bizarre nature of the political narrative in the States, doesn't it?
I mean, have you heard this thing that if he really feels he's going to lose, he'd rather quit and give it to J.D. Vance and actually run? I mean, I don't think we can give any credibility to that, but we're in strange territory with Trump at the moment.
Yeah,
I mean, that 2 hours with Musk last week was really weird.
Yeah,
it was ridiculous. And, you know, he is, well, as I said in my blog last week, I mean, he is so dangerous, Musk. He is absolutely awful. And there's absolutely nothing, as far as I can tell, that we can do about it. But, you know, if he can take on the elected leader in a democratically elected leader of a country thousands of miles away, i.e. Britain, and say civil war is coming to your streets, talking about Britain, where, yes, thugs went on the street and they, you know, were in many cases following the, if you like, suggestion of online material. But we don't have automatic weapons easily available in this country. We don't have militia in this country. If he starts saying, oh, you know, if Kamala Harris gets in, there will be civil war, that's really frightening. And I think, you know, Kamala Harris at the moment she's like sunshine, but there is a very, very dark cloud about what happens to Trump, what happens to the Republicans, and what happens, whatever the outcome of the election.
Yeah, he's already flagging, isn't he, that he's saying that Kamala Harris's nomination is unconstitutional. Now, load of nonsense, of course, but he's already starting to put those blocks in place of, you know, if the election doesn't go the way he wants it to go, then he's going to start to challenge it in the same way he did 4 years ago. And this is where you've really got to question the judgment of the Republican Party leadership. You know, those sort of old hands who've been around for a long time, who thought after he was defeated by Biden 4 years back, they could just put Trump in a box and he'd go away. Well, the chickens have come home to roost, of course. And we can laugh about the bizarre nature of the statements that he's making. We can look at Vance and say, what a clown he is. But if you fast forward to November and she does win narrowly, and I think it's going to be a narrow victory for whoever comes out as the victor, what's going to happen then? And it is.
Well, he actually said it would be a bloodbath. It's the most irresponsible thing to say.
It's awful.
Trump said that, did he?
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
it's terrible, and you know, it is really frightening. And when you've got somebody who says, "Oh, the crowds at whatever airport Kamala Harris landed at last week, no, they're not there. It's AI. It's fake." And
yes,
there was a woman from the, you know, whatever, Women for Republican something or other, and she said, "No, you can tell they're fake." And the bloke on the BBC was saying, "These are BBC photographs. This is BBC footage. You know, we don't do that." Yeah, you do. And you just think, okay, actually, why didn't Trump ask Elon Musk why he's going into space? Because clearly the world is flat, so you don't need to go into space.
Yeah. It is, as I say, very, very bizarre election, but one that we can have a little smile about at the moment, but may turn into something far darker. So it is a story we will continue to come back to, of course, because the American election is the biggest one that's going to happen this year. But for now, we will leave it there. We'll allow James to take his point from the weekend, whilst Joe and I lick our wounds from West Ham and Everton's defeat.
Early days, Frank. Early days.
Early days. Listen, as you say,
that's the theme of this podcast. It's early days. And by the way, conventions, they're wonderful things. I went to the 1976 convention in New York where Jimmy Carter was nominated. They're absolutely fabulous. I mean, you know, even now in these difficult days, Americans really love their politics, you know, and they make it a real jamboree. You know, they meet up from all over the country and have a fantastic time. And the roll call of the states, I love that. You know, Arizona casts 50 votes. Arizona, the state of the eternal sun, and Nevada, the gambling capital of the world. We cast our votes for the next president of the United States. It's absolutely wonderful.
Sounds just like the best days of the Liberal Democrat conferences.
Yeah, well, the last one was in a phone box, Joe, but we won't go into that.
Not anymore.
No, I think, you know, if you've not watched a convention, a Democrat convention, and this one is going to be special because they've gone from a party that was on the floor and very depressed to one that now thinks it's got a chance. And for all the historic reasons that we know about, Kamala Harris is potentially going to be the first female and woman of colour president. You know, what an amazing fate that will be for her. if she does win in November. And then, as I mentioned, you've got Obama doing a turn. You've got Joe Biden, who I'm sure will be good, actually, despite what I said
Hillary
earlier.
Clinton.
Hillary
Michelle
might.
Obama.
Well, they don't know, do they, whether it's
I'm
going to
not
be
sure whether she'll
Hillary
do one.
or
But-
Bill. Bill might do one. I think they're a bit fret, aren't they? Fret of Hillary doing something because she lost to Trump. So you might see them wheel Bill out. But I think, it's all eyes on Thursday, because when you turn to the serious politics of this, there hasn't been much mention of policy. And actually, I think Harris needs to switch the narrative now, stop the name calling, and demonstrate that she's the serious politician with answers to the problems that clearly America has. So Thursday, she should be using that platform not to continue I'm sure she'll make a couple of jokes at Trump and Vance's expense, and rightly so. But the main body of her contribution on Thursday, I think, has to be policy. And she needs to start to get the message across as to what she's done about immigration, because actually immigration is now falling in the States. The economy is picking up. And I heard, again, go back to these other podcasts we all listen to, somebody saying, it was a Republican actually, the Democrats are always worried about bragging about the economic benefits that they've brought to the country, because there are always some people who are still losing. And they don't feel comfortable saying, oh, haven't we done well on the economy, when you've still got some people in poverty and some people who haven't done as well as everybody else. But his point was, they've actually got a really good record on the economy over the past 4 years, and they need to start talking about it. So hopefully she will begin to do that on Thursday. Anyway, we will be looking back at that convention next week, I'm sure, and talking about whatever else happens during the next 7 days in the world of politics. It is a bank holiday Monday, so are you guys going off to do something, or are you okay to join us? Do I have to get a substitute wheeled in?
I think I'm all right. Let me just
I was
check
wondering
Michelle's
whether we could do it on the Tuesday.
Well, I think Jim's going to be benched next week, ladies and
No,
gents.
no. Well, no. If no, I don't want to be benched. I'll if you've got to do it on the Monday, I'll do it on the Monday.
Now you see, that's how you negotiate with Aslef.
I can do Monday, because I don't.
I can do Monday. I'm teacher's pet.
Well, I don't do
I'm
Spanish
always available.
practices, Jim.
Right, well, the stopwatch is well gone now, Jim, and it's your fault for prevaricating in the last few moments of the podcast. Listen, I'm going to say bye and hope to see you all next week.
If you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, then you will love our TFI Friday bulletin. That's Thank Frank It's Friday. The bulletin includes blogs from Jim Hancock, Joe Phillips and myself, plus some words from our man in America, Martin Littrop. There's also HR advice and updates from Victoria Brown, and our hospitality hero, Stephen Heskett, talks all things visitor economy. You can subscribe to our bulletin for free. Just visit downtownandbusiness.com, go to the subscription page and register your interest there. It's free, it's TFI, and it's well worth a read.